Good morning and welcome to another edition of 15 Minutes of Flame. This is Robert Phoenix, broadcasting to you live from the South Pole. No, not really, although it feels like it. The temperature is still in the brisk 30s here in South Central Texas, aka the Hill Country, as I broadcast to you with a block of cement between my eyes, thanks to our good pal, the cedar tree, and the cedar fever that goes right along with it. Ah, the joys, the joys, the joys, the joys. How is everybody? Are we off to a rollicking start to the new year? Our third day of 2018. Wow, there's a lot going on, as always, and it is my incumbent duty to report on what is happening. So one of the things we're going to get into today is the solar minimum and how this current cold wave might be indicative of something much bigger. Now, I've been kind of following this for the last couple months, and certainly the data is appearing to look like we are headed towards a cold spell. Global cooling, not global warming. The sunspot activity is at a new high or new low, depending upon how you want to look at it. Probably a new low is the most obvious measurement we can apply to this. So I was sent an article by Lynn, one of my listeners, and it's actually a really good article, and I'm going to cover some of that today. And we're going to get into this whole solar minimum and what it might mean, and not just what it might mean in terms of us, but also in terms of the historical precedent that has been set during periods and phases like this, and what we might actually expect during a time like this. So you're not going to want to miss it. It's going to be pretty informative, albeit a little on the dark side, but it'll be informative nonetheless. Kim Jong-un is playing a chess match now with Mr. 4D, and his new move is to set up a line of communication between himself and South Korea, which has not existed for quite some time, as the two have been bitter enemies since the Korean War. Or are they? This is something we have to ask ourselves always. Are they really bitter enemies? Is this just yet another pantomime on the global stage, on the global theater, on the global front? And is this all just about ratcheting up fear and building up more weapons and selling more weapons to South Korea, arming Japan, which pretty much was turned into a pacifist country after World War II, and the Marshall Plan, is now buying a lot of weapons from the United States. Japan's getting armed. So North Korea has been really good for the arms business in this country, or so it seems. Kim Jong-un wants to send some athletes to the Winter Games in Seoul. Not in Seoul, where they no, I forget the name of the place. But he wants to send athletes, and it'll be interesting to see what happens and how Kim Jong-un continues to make this outreach to South Korea's progressive president. This guy, his last name is Moon, I believe, and he tends to, the public record shows that he's much more progressive than his predecessor. In fact, I think astrologically he's an Aquarian, so he's got some Aquarian kinds of values, and he wants to pursue this relationship with North Korea. So Kim Jong-un and Trump got into who's got the better and the bigger button yesterday. Remember, it's all 4D chess, 5D chess. Of course, it's just a layer of distraction while the real work, the real heavy lifting, the real draining of the swamp is taking place. And it could be. It absolutely could be. One can make a case that this is just a huge kind of bait and switch that Trump and the Trump administration is playing So we'll have to see again how all this plays out. I would be, I don't know, I'd be very surprised if we went to war against North Korea, but I would also not be surprised if we went to war with North Korea as well. Remember, we've got that Mars-Saturn conjunction, and that's coming up in the month of April, May. So March, April, May, Mars-Saturn conjunction. And if you want to look at the heavy duty energy, it's going to be right around then. And of course, the Mars Pluto conjunction as well, which is a bit further out. So, we have some hot spots that we're entering into on the global stage and even on the domestic front as well. So keep that in mind. Another listener sent me a post about the new age starting in roughly 3 days. I'm not going to cover that today. I may cover that on Friday. I need to spend a little more time with that. So, in my estimation, yes, the beginning of the new age started in the 1960s. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius and all that stuff, right? But the actual sort of curtain rising on the stage, the global stage of the new age, to me, that was always going to occur. Pluto Aquarius, Saturn Aquarius. This is part of the cyclical progression between Capricorn and the end of the government as we know it. And trust me, by the time we get through this Capricornian cycle, government as we know it is going to be very, very different. The world will be redrawn. And then what comes after that is the Aquarian cycle. It's a much larger Aquarian cycle as well. Trump has been on the warpath. He's been threatening to defund Pakistan and also to defund Palestine. And apparently Palestine got about $1 billion last year. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. If he does, I guarantee you the Russians will step in, and the Russians and the Chinese will step in as well. I mean, they're going to be picking up sort of the jilted lovers or the broken relationships. We'll see China and Russia pick them up. And then as the United States moves towards its much more centrist and supportive view of the nation-state of Israel, we'll see new alliances begin to emerge in the Middle East. We've already seen it with Russia and Syria, and I would not be surprised if Russia now has a relationship with Yemen. By the way, if you haven't looked into the Houthis are actually quite interesting. Of course, they're an offshoot of the Shia Muslim sect. But unlike the Shia, these are people that are really driven by some form of outrage on a political level. So these are kind of activists, Muslims in some ways. They don't like Saudi Arabia, they don't like Israel, and they don't like the United States. And this is who Saudi Arabia is fighting against. And of course, they've kind of incorporated some of the tribal factions of the Yemeni people to fight against the Houthis, but the Houthis are kicking their ass. So I would not be surprised if also Russia shows up here at some point and becomes a covert ally. Now, the whole thing is really fascinating from a kind of a global theater perspective. Because when you drill down into Trump, what are you drilling down into? Ultimately, you're drilling down into his relationship with Jared Kushner, Chabad Lubavitch, and Vladimir Putin and Russia. Because Chabad Lubavitch has an extremely strong home base or stronghold in the former Soviet Union. In fact, you can go online and you can see Putin hanging out with the heads of Chabad Lubavitch. If you don't know what Chabad Lubavitch is, they are centers that are set up in the United States. It's a kind of a branch of Judaism that is, how should we say, extremely activist. They've been characterized recently as being happy-go-lucky. I wouldn't necessarily say that. I would say that they're very, very aggressive in terms of their goals. And their goals, number one, is to maintain the nation state of Israel, of course, supporting Trump's move to move the capital or the American embassy to Jerusalem, and thus recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And that's, of course, in occupied, quote unquote, territory. Now, it's been brought to my attention that Trump signed a 6-month waiver, and that this is what presidents have been doing ever since this whole idea of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital has taken place. So what happens is that a president will sign this waiver and they'll delay it 6 months, and they keep doing this. Now, it'll be interesting to see what happens roughly 5 months from now, because Trump announced this in December. So what are we talking? January, February, March, April, May, June. It'll be right around June. Of course, that'll be the time of Trump's birthday, and we will be sitting on the porch of the midterms. So it'll be very interesting to see where we are around June as it relates to this waiver that continues to get signed and pushed down the line. So is Trump playing yet another shell game with the Israelis? We'll see. We'll find out. At some point, the whole idea of 4D or 5D chess is going to become more explicit, if it's real or not real, if Trump is essentially tricking or conning or fronting the people that he's making these promises to and for. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, why not? I mean, we're here now, and what else is going to take place? Are we going to we're going to tie our anchors to Bernie Sanders and the progressives and the left, who are basically, well, I mean, look, Sanders appeals to the one thing that Sanders did that Hillary Clinton didn't do, is that he actually appealed to the working class. He appealed to people who had lost their jobs. He appealed to people who had a massive distrust of, big government, not big government, I take that back, massive distrust of big corporations, massive distrust of Wall Street versus Main Street. And so Sanders tapped into that. What Sanders didn't tap into is his testosterone, and basically saying, hey, look, I got screwed by the DNC and Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Hillary Clinton. Donna Brazil, she bore witness to that. And he could have run on his own. He could have run as an independent. And I bet you he probably could have beaten Donald Trump, because he was people have made the observation that Trump and Sanders were basically saying the same thing, but coming at it from different perspectives. For Trump, it's top down. We're going to get to a 15% tax rate. We're going to allow Wall Street and corporations to profit and prosper from this so they can come back into the country, create jobs, stimulate the economy, and therefore the working man and the working woman would be rewarded by the movement of corporate energy back into the country. Whereas Sanders wanted to essentially tax the shit out of corporations and then grab their money and then build that into the government and have massive entitlements. That was basically his plan. And if you're already on board the globalist train and you've got your company overseas, let's say like Apple, you've got it headquartered in a place like Ireland where you can basically hold all your money, and you've got your manufacturing in a place like China. You're already there, and now Sanders is going to penalize you even more. Well, why would you come back to the United States at that point in time? This is where the two, Trump and Sanders, sort of part company. Now, it remains to be seen, even if Trump's corporations will come back to the United States and do what they are supposed to do, theoretically, which is create jobs. We don't know that. It could be just another money grab, right? I mean, when a restaurant is doing really, really great business, do they lower their prices? No, they don't. In many cases, they'll even raise their prices if they're doing well. And that's the nature of business. So we'll see. We'll see between now and the midterms, and hopefully we'll see some success stories. What we'll see is we'll see more globalist shuck and jive, and we'll figure out probably by then kind of where things are. There's a lot that's going to happen between now and the midterms. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to get into this solar minimum piece because it's pretty interesting, and I'm probably going to read this. This is from Armstrong Economics, which is a pretty interesting website, and it basically links the solar minimum to the economy and how there is an economic downturn with the solar minimum. So I'm going to read you the question here. So Marty is, I guess, Martin Armstrong. So here's a question from somebody who frequents the website. Happy New Year, not written in a while, but wanted to ask a private question related to the forthcoming cold period. A, how long will it last? Will it start now and go into 2024? When does Socrates say it will start to reverse? And when will temperatures be back to where they are now? B, how far south does someone have to go who is allergic to cold anyway? Is it best to keep away from volcanic islands? And C, is it in your view a minor cold blip, or oh my God, we're all going to freeze to death and run out of food? Just so I know the prognosis. I thought it would be helpful if you could ask Socrates the relevant question. As I think there are a number of folks who would mind knowing the answers to these types of questions privately. Trust all is well with you, BR. Okay, so this is going to be a kind of a long read, but I think we can all sort of sit through it. It's worth it. So here's the answer. Socrates was projecting that the peak of this cycle aligned with the ECM 2015.75. That's the year 2015. This is a longitudinal cycle, not transverse. That means peak to bottom varies. This wave should be a 13-year decline from 2015, making it 2028 at best. So we're talking about a 13-year cycle. But then he goes on to say the outside projection calls for a 17-year decline, and that lines up with the peak in the ECM 2032. So we can be looking at 17 years worth of cold. Okay. Worse still, the rate of decline will be brutal. This implies we are looking at the fastest decline in nearly 10,000 years. I suppose that is appropriate since we're also at a 5,000-year low in interest rates as well. There is additional research correlating sunspot activity to planetary orbits. Real scientists are exploring climate change as a part of nature rather than man, and the correlations are interesting. The movement of planets, solar activity, and global climate change are increasingly being explored. The periodicity of solar activity, along with the physical mechanism of the changing of the sun, is an important topic in solar physics. Unlike the global warming crowd pushing fake research to get $1 billion in grants from government welfare, real investigation into global climate change and solar activity is incredibly vital and important subject in geophysics, which government is not funding with handouts because it does not support raising taxes. There was a German astronomer, Samuel Heinrich Schwabe, 1789 to 1875, founder of the sunspot theory, who discovered a regular cycle or variation in the number of sunspots occurring over a 17-year span. Schwabe, 1843. There was a Russian professor, A.L. Chizhevsky, also spelled Shizevsky, who lived between 1897 to 1964, who initiated Schwabe's sunspot theory and plotted an 11-year cycle back to the 5th century BC. He did that in 1924. By 1900, the investigations into sunspots by the Russian scientist Chizhevsky began to explore the connections between solar variations, weather, and their impact on human activity during World War I. Chizhevsky noticed between 1916 and 1917 the period of peak sunspot activity and the solar explosions that followed, how these correlated with the war. He compared this with events in history to ascertain whether there was any connection. The historical database of 500 BC to 1922 AD, a period of 2,422 years that covered 72 countries, was compiled. by Chejevsky in 1938. He included in his compilations signs of human unrest and excitability such as wars, revolutions, riots, expeditions, and migrations. Chejevsky included additional factors such as the number of humans involved, the quality of the event, and the size of the area affected. Additionally, he included the time when the unrest began and its high point, which was reduced to arithmetical values of varying significance. With his volumes of data, Professor Chejevsky constructed a year-by-year index of mass human excitability that covered the past 24 centuries in an amazing panorama of man's emotional moods. After evaluating the most important events, Chejevsky noticed that the most important human events had occurred during 80% of the maximum sunspot activity. He did that in 1938. The only problem with Chejevsky's work was still the one-dimensional thought process of trying to discover the signal cause to the effect. The actual results are far more complex and dynamic, yet Chejevsky made a major contribution in investigating sunspots. Combining this data with ice core samples broadens the scope, and now we begin to see the climate take shape. Additionally, we have to inject disease, plagues, and pandemics where we add this data. We then begin to see it is the lack of sunspot activity, the lack that leads to disease, plagues, and pandemics. This in turn feeds migrations and was a leading cause of the invasion of Europe by the Huns. However, it was the Huns pushing west that drove the Goths to invade Rome. It is the decline of the Roman Empire if the decline of the Roman Empire was in part also caused by climate change. Scientists have used tree rings to catalog the climate's history. In fact, tree rings grow more during fertile years that result in thick tree rings. During dry years, tree rings grow far more narrowed and thus identify the climate cycle. Wood samples from sites throughout Europe collected from ancient Roman ruins have revealed that in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it coincides with a period of unusually thin rings, implying cold and dry periods. Correlating all the data from tree rings to ice cores and sunspot activity, what is clear is that society expands with global warming and collapses during global cooling. Voting for some political party, left or right, cannot change the climate. Politicians cannot even balance a budget, so they can play God? Question mark. Wet and warm summers occurred during periods of every expansion of civilization, being Sumerian to the modern internet age. The decline in the energy output of the sun is lethal to civilization. This contributed to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire that was already economically weakened. The climate turned down from about 200 AD and bottomed out around 600 AD. That's a long cycle. So we're talking the Dark Ages. If you want to, pin a little label on that period, that's the Dark Ages in Europe. Dark Ages in the sense that everything goes dark. The weather goes dark. Everything is cold. Rome has been overthrown. The light of reason has been dimmed, so to speak. Unless, of course, you lived in a cathedral school. So the dry and cold period of the 3rd century AD coincided with the economic decline of Rome, but it also provided the reason for the barbarian invasion. This led to the economic and political turmoil resulted in the barbarians invading the northern provinces, including Gaul. Once again, climate change was not the sole cause of the decline and fall. This contributed to the cause behind the barbarian invasions. There were two major plagues that became pandemics during the decline and fall. There was one right following the top in about 180 AD, known as the Antonine Plague, but this was followed by the plague of Cyprian in the middle of the turbulent 3rd century, and then the 6th century plague of Justinian. That's a major plague, by the way. It took place in Constantinople, which may have finished the job. Now, Constantinople was the outpost of Rome. After Rome fell, Constantinople stuck around for a period of time. But then they had the Justinian plague. The Emperor Justinian, which may have finished up, the ancient sources make the Justinian or the plague of Justinian sound apocalyptic. The death toll of Constantinople was horrific. People died by the tens of thousands per day. The Emperor Justinian appointed a special officer by the name of Theodore in charge of coordinating the removal of corpses from the city's streets. Theodore created mass graves, with each pit filled with 70,000 corpses. We do know that archaeologists have assumed that mass mortality events go hand in hand with large communal burials. The Justinian plague appears to have resulted in a death toll of 35 to 55% of the population within just a few months during the 555 AD, quite similar to the Black Death of the 14th century, both of which were caused by rats, by the way, theoretically. The Justinian plague was most certainly caused by rats. And mass graves have been discovered concerning the plague of Cyprian in Egypt and Rome. The plague of Cyprian, the Carthaginian bishop and eyewitness for whom the plague is named. Here, the plague began in Ethiopia around Easter of 250 AD. It reached Rome in the following year by travel, through trade, and spread to Greece and then on to Syria. The plague lasted for about 20 years. At its peak, it was reported to have killed as many as 5,000 people per day in Rome. Periods of drought, cold, floods, and famine exhausted the populations of the Roman Empire. St. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, said at the time it appeared as if the world was at an end. There have been several protracted solar minimums since 1000 AD. We have the Oort minimum from 1040 to 1080 AD, the medieval minor minimum from 1150 to 1200 AD, the Wolf minimum from 1270 to 1350 AD, the Sporer minimum from 1430 to 1520 AD, the Maunder minimum from 1620 to 1710 AD, and lastly the Dalton minimum from 1787 to 1843. The post-Dalton minimum peaked strangely with the economic confidence model. That was in 1989.95. The peaks in solar activity have been declining with each wave subsequent to that turning point. It is now declining faster than ever previously known for the last 10,000 years. So keep an extra supply of canned goods. They might come in handy. So I'm just sharing this with you because this is what we do. We talk about things. We share information. Forewarned is forearmed. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open what's possible, all that stuff. But we certainly are in a very cold phase and cycle in the immediate. Now, whether or not this extends out for the next, what are we talking about, to 2024, right? Or no, it's about 17 years from now, so 2030. That remains to be seen. I guess we'll find out. Now, what's interesting, although perhaps linked, but something we'd have to address or really look at, is this flu that's going around, and it's a devastating flu. And people are getting extremely sick, violently ill. I haven't seen a flu this contagious and debilitating for a very long time. So it's happening in conjunction with this polar front that has really stretched down and taken hold to a large part of the country. Very, very intense time just in terms of the weather. Now it's going to change. Obviously, at some point it will. But we're going to have to watch, keep our eye on the solar minimum and the impact it has on the climate and the environment. Interesting times as things in Korea theoretically heat up, although I'm not sure. The planet itself is certainly cooling down in a pretty big way. Well, why don't we leave it there for today? And a brisk 34 minutes here on 15 Minutes of Flame. And, what I try to do at times when I bring you something like this is also to, get you to look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is nothing lasts forever. I mean, this is part of the big picture. And even though we have this surreal political theater, there is something else going on behind the scenes. And that something else is the potential for a brand new physical reality. And for us to understand that in terms of our own mortality, our own relationships, this is a really important sort of concept and notion to wrap our heads around. And when we do that, we're living much closer to the reality of the cycle of life and death and rebirth, which are all very Plutonian in a lot of ways. So anyway, just understand that and keep that close to your heart. When you do, guess what happens? Things become much more profound in a lot of ways. They stand out. You take time to notice things. You get into your food more. You get into your connections with people more. You don't have to walk around like a moribund goth. That's not really sort of the. When I talk about goth, I'm not talking about the goths from the Middle Ages. I'm talking about tones on tail goth and that kind of goth. You don't have to walk around like that. But understanding that we live in a precarious balance between life and death and abundance and scarcity, that sometimes it really brings things into clarity and focus and distills what's important in our lives. So I leave you with that today. And you know the drill. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to step in what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix, and my message to you is stay warm. I'll see everybody tomorrow.